Thank you again for everyone joining us as we continue our discussions on human rights hotspots around the globe. I'm John Hilbolt, Director of Lectures and Seminars, and it's my privilege to welcome those who have joined us here for our Asia discussion. We will, of course, post our program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference following today's presentations. I would ask, if you've joined us, to make sure that cell phones have been turned off as a courtesy to our speakers. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion on this topic today is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. He serves as an adjunct professor as well at Georgetown University, where he leads a graduate seminar on American foreign policy interests in Southeast Asia. Prior to joining us at Heritage, he served as Senior Vice President and Executive Director at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. He has also been a Senior Professional Republican Staff Member for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and a policy aide for Senator John McCain on advising on trade, defense, and foreign policy issues. Please join me in welcoming Walter Lohman. Walter?
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm not going to go into a very long introduction, but we've got a few very distinguished guests and knowledgeable friends of the Heritage Foundation to walk us through some of the priority issues in Asia. First, we're going to turn to Suzanne Schulte. I really wish today I could introduce her as Congresswoman Suzanne Schulte, but it didn't turn out the way that we had all hoped. Unfortunately, I don't even get to vote for you. I have to, after many years of having to vote for either Jim Moran or someone else, now I get the great choice of Don Beyer. But that said, you're a long-time, Suzanne is a long-time activist on North Korea. And many other issues besides, a real mover on these issues. And it's a pleasure to have her here. I was telling her earlier I wish we'd have her here more often to talk about these things. But she is president of something called the Defense Forum Foundation. She's been there since 1988. She's chairman of the North Korean Freedom Coalition. Suzanne, of her many accomplishments, the two I just wanted to point out was one, the award of the Seoul Peace Prize that you received in 2008, which is a really big deal. Any award that Václav Havel also got is, I think, a worthy achievement. And the other one is the Walter Judd Freedom Award that you won. I'm a great admirer of Walter Judd. In fact, another winner of that award is Lee Edwards, who was a biographer of his. His legacy, if you don't know who he is, his legacy is one that you really ought to pay some attention to, and I hope it's one that this town never forgets. I think the fact that they would give the prize to you, the Fund for American Studies would give it to you, is the best way possible to keep his legacy alive, someone who's active, someone who's moving on these issues. So congratulations on that, as well as your many other achievements. And then we're going to turn to Bob Fu. Pastor Fu is a very good friend of Heritage. We do see him quite often. He himself was a victim of religious persecution in China. He's one of the student leaders from 1989. Those two things combined, a Christian activist and student activist, not good things to have on your resume, I think, probably in Beijing. And so he came here in 1996, forced to flee basically for quote-unquote illegal evangelism. The organization that Bob founded and is now president of, China Aid, is committed to promoting religious freedom in China and raising awareness of the problems that believers face there. And I think that's really important, not just because it's one of this sort of panoply of issues we focus on. It is perhaps the most important issue area that we focus on. But I also think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the situation in China when it comes to religious freedom among very knowledgeable people. I think there's sometimes the idea that it's a little bit more sanguine a situation than it indeed is. And then we're going to turn to John Sifton. John is an Asia Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. John also is a good friend of Heritage Foundation and a frequent collaborator of mine on many issues that we care equally about. We just saw you earlier this week talking about Sri Lanka, and I think you were here last year talking about North Korea with Bruce, and certainly we worked together quite a bit on Burma. So we're really glad to have you here again, John. John is going to talk about a couple priority areas including Burma, which is important, I think, because this is really one of the few success stories in the administration's foreign policy narrative. One, I think, once you really dig into it a little bit, is not the success that it's claimed to be. It's not all bad, but it's also not a whole new dawn in Burma. In fact, I think 2015 could be a very difficult year there. But I'll let John talk to us about all of that, and then anything else that he'd like to talk about. So with that, let me turn it over to Congresswoman Schulte, and she'll get us started.
Well, thank you all very much. It's a real honor to be here, Walter. Thank you, and thank you to Kathy for helping to arrange this event today. I really appreciate being here at the Heritage Foundation. It's a huge honor, but also to be on a panel with these distinguished gentlemen, Bob Fu and John Sifton. I have 10 or 15 minutes to talk about North Korea, and I do want to go quickly because I do want to be sure to give Bob and John as much time as possible, too, because this is a really amazing group of folks to talk about Asia hotspots. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the situation today, some of the dramatic changes that have happened in North Korea, and what are the things that we should be doing to help the North Korean people and to change the dynamics for the better in North Korea. First of all, at this very moment, as you know, hundreds of thousands of people are dying in North Korea in political prison camps from the terrible conditions there. People are being repatriated because they're trying to escape and being executed for trying to escape. And while the world has recognized, finally, the horrific things that are going on in North Korea, as we saw with the Commission of Inquiry's report last year, concluding that North Korea was committing human rights violations without parallel in the contemporary world, while we see this recognition, the situation in North Korea remains the worst tragedy in the world today, in my opinion, and the refugee situation is worse than ever. Where else in the world but in North Korea are children born in political prison camps or can be sent with their entire families and live their entire lives in political prison camps? Where else in the world can a man be publicly executed for making a long-distance phone call? Where else in the world do we see the government of a country turning the backs on the buying and selling of its own people, as all the females that cross the border that are escaping out of North Korea to China, 80–90% of them are subject to human trafficking because of the one-child policy in China has led to a shortage of women. Where else in the world have we seen so many people died from the famine in a so-called industrialized nation in the absence of war? That's never happened in modern history, that we've had that type of occurrence happen. This is the only country in the world that does not enjoy a single human right under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in a very cruel irony, this document was passed in 1948, the year that Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current dictator, came to power. And of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed in response to the horrible tragedies that had happened against the Jewish people, but also the people of China, also the people of North Korea, the horrors that had been committed by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. So 1948 was the year that Kim Il-sung came to power to ensure that the North Koreans would have not one single of these human rights. But why is it that it's only this year, or excuse me, last year, that the UN finally recognized the severity there? And part of the problem is the lack of access. As you know, North Korea is described as the hermit kingdom and that people are very isolated. But this lack of access has contributed to a lot of inaction. And I wanted to just show a quick picture here of this first picture. Many of you recognize her, Malayla. This young 14-year-old girl who was shot by the Taliban has become an international celebrity, rightly so. She was shot by the Taliban, 14 years old, because she advocated for females to have the right to have education. And she was hosted at the United Nations and has become a symbol of standing up for the right of girls and against this kind of repression. But if you put up the next picture, not many people have heard of this young lady, 14 years old, just like same age as Malayla. Her name is No Yi-ji. She and 8 other North Korean orphans were trying to get to South Korea, Memorial Day 2013, They got all the way to Laos. They thought they were going to be able to go to South Korea. And the government of China, the government of Laos, and the regime in North Korea conspired to force this young lady and the 8 other people with her, children, teenagers, back to North Korea. That's the kind of cruel dictatorship that we're dealing with the help of other countries like China. Now, I do have hope for North Korea because there have been dramatic changes, and I want to talk quickly about those dramatic changes and then address the things that we ought to be doing. There have been 2 major sources of control by the regime that came completely apart under the dictatorship of Kim Jong-il. First was the public distribution system, and the public distribution system is what made the North Korean people completely dependent on the regime. Food, all material goods were all controlled by an elaborate classification system known as Sungbun, and the distribution of your food was done by this classification. But this public distribution system, which made everybody completely dependent on the regime, has completely fallen apart. And we have seen capitalism thriving in North Korea with the explosion of markets during the famine and during the regime of Kim Jong-il. We can identify over 200 markets by satellite. This is the North Koreans, through their own sheer determination, coming up with a way to survive, trading and buying among themselves. And this is why we don't see the level of starvation that we saw before. This is a remarkable difference. And you can track the times that the regime tried to control the markets, tried to stop the markets, tried to do a currency devaluation, tried to rein in control of the markets, fail again and again and again. And so through sheer determination, the North Koreans have been able to survive through these markets. So this is a huge change, because the only people that are completely dependent on the regime now are the elites in Pyongyang. The North Koreans outside of the Pyongyang are really dependent on each other. So this is a huge change. Another huge change has been the isolation. It really is no longer the hermit kingdom. And as I like to point out, the information age hit North Korea as well during this time period of the famine. And they have, now we believe that at least 60 to 80% of North Koreans have access to information outside of the government's propaganda. This is a huge, huge difference, a huge dramatic change. And I want to share one story with you. Many of you remember the film Titanic. Well, films, Western films, South Korean soap operas, South Korean movies, all of these became flowing into North Korea. And I like to remind people that, how many of you have VCRs? Yeah, see, a couple people, right? Well, where did all those VCRs go? Well, where would there be a market for VCRs when everyone's gone to digital and DVDs? Well, back during the famine years, the savvy Chinese businessman found a market for VCRs, and that was in North Korea. And North Korea was flooded with VCRs, and now with DVDs, but now with cell phones, but now all this technology is getting in there. And that's all these flows of the movies and the films were being distributed all over North Korea. And you hear from defectors that seeing the film Titanic was very powerful. That movie was was seen by so many, the regime felt it had to come back with some kind of explanation of what that movie was about. And the regime said, this wasn't really a love story. This was really a depiction of the failure of capitalism, because the Titanic sunk on April 15th, 1912, which happened to be the same year that Kim Il-sung was born. So they tried to create some propaganda to respond to this, and I've met quite a number of defectors that have seen that movie, and one woman told me that she watched it, she got reported, she was fearful of being arrested, but the state security agent that came knocking on her door said, I won't tell anybody if you give me the movie. So she didn't tell anybody, but she eventually escaped with her son. But the greatest change that's happened in North Korea is the fact that over 26,000 people have escaped that country. And many of them are communicating with their family members back home. They're using brokers or hiring brokers in China, because you can't make a call directly from South Korea into North Korea because they have a closed cell phone system. But they will hire a broker who will call their loved ones, their family members. And so information is coming in that way, but they're also coming up with creative ways to get money and support in for their families they left behind. So that's a huge difference as well. And you see now when people have escaped from North Korea, you're seeing more people are escaping, they're making a conscientious decision to leave. Whereas in the beginning of the flood of refugees during the famine, it was really because of starvation. Now more and more they're making a conscientious decision to leave the country. So what must be done in light of all of this? North Korea went to the headlines because of the dictator and the Sony hacking and all that. Why did they react that way? Well, this shows us what are the things that they're most afraid of. And the fact that they reacted the way they did to this film shows their concerns because they have set their dictator up as a god. And to have a movie come out that mocks him and that suggests that we're targeting him for assassination is something that they cannot tolerate. There are people even thinking of. So I wanted to show a quick slide from, if you want to show that next one. This is a cartoon that the North Koreans put out there when we had North Korea Freedom Week in South Korea. We had North Korea Freedom Week in the United States for about 6 years, and then we moved it to South Korea, North Korea Freedom Week. This was how they responded to North Korea Freedom Week. How they respond to things tells us what they're afraid of, and it means that we should be doing more of these things. You'll notice that in this bag of goodies that we're carrying into North Korea, there is a microphone. And the information flow is so critical. They're afraid of information coming in. They do everything they can to block the radio broadcast that we do called Free North Korea Radio. We're on every day for an hour broadcasting true information. It's produced by North Korean defectors, and it's the radio program they do the most to try to jam. But in addition, VOA, RFA, it is so important to support these broadcasters. They are afraid of this information. And getting as much information in North Korea is absolutely critical. And it is important. The internet is also very important, but and I know Bob Fu will back me up on this, but we've got to keep supporting VOA and RFA because the regimes like China and like North Korea, they can find out who's on the internet. They can block things on the internet, but they can't block the radio broadcast, and they don't know who's listening to radio unless they're there to catch them in the act, whereas they can find out who's tuning into something on the internet. So radio will continue to be critically important. So number one, the information flow is critically important. This is one of the things they're very afraid of. Second thing is, you'll notice in this bag of goodies are leaflets. We've been doing balloon launches. Why is it that they threaten the balloon launchers with Scud missiles? Because this information that's coming in through leaflets, we're sending in radios, we're sending in money to prop what we call our economic stimulus package for the markets. Getting information in through the balloons launches is also very critical. And that's another thing they're afraid of. You also notice that there's a baby kangaroo there who has a white bandana with a red dot, symbolizing Japan. The Japanese have been very strong on the human rights issues. They've been very adamant about not helping North Korea because of the abduction issue. They cut off aid very early. They're very afraid of the alliance that Japan has with South Korea and the United States, and you can see them trying to break apart that alliance. So that's another thing they're afraid of, is the democratic countries in the region working together. Another thing that they're afraid of are the events that we do. North Korea Freedom Week, when we stand up and we speak out, they've been condemning the Commission of Inquiry's report. They were very much condemning of that. When people stand up and talk about these issues, and then one of the things I'm most proud of, because I happen to be a Christian, is the cross. And they also are afraid of Christians. And that's why the Christian church, they've done everything they can to try to destroy Christianity in North Korea, because the dictator is the god. And that's a direct threat to the regime. And so these are the kinds of things that we should be doing. We should be doing as much information flow as we can, getting as much information as we can getting in there. We should press on the human rights issues, because the North Koreans will never give up their nuclear program. They've always acted in bad faith. We should make human rights the most important thing that we emphasize when it comes to the regime. We should do everything we can to empower the North Korean defectors and getting a message out there. And I'm going to wrap up real quickly. One thing that is absolutely critical that we don't have in North Korea, which shows how the repression is worse than ever before, is dissidence. And we must do everything we can to create dissidence in North Korea. And I have suggested a three-pronged approach. Number one, to communicate to the elites in the military, which is what we do through the radio broadcast, communicate to the elites both in the military and serve the regime there is a way forward. Because for them, They don't see any choice in life other than being loyal to the dictatorship, because everything in their lives is wrapped up in Kim Jong-un's success, whether their child goes to Kim Il-sung University, whether they get that new Mercedes. So the elites are totally loyal to the regime because they don't see any other way. And we have to communicate that signal. We've done a very intense job of trying to reach out to the military. We have an organization called the North Korea People's Liberation Front, because we saw that there was a time in history in North Korea when the military actually operated against the regime. And we need to exploit that. We have so many people that served in the military in North Korea that are now living in freedom in South Korea. But the other thing, too, America, this Congress that's just come in, has got to pass H.R. 1771. It's the North Korea Sanction Enforcement Act. It is very much targeted, very carefully, to that regime, to Kim Jong-un and the people in that regime. H.R. 1771, we're pressing for the passage of that. It doesn't affect humanitarian aid or anything that people are doing outside. It is targeted specifically at that regime. We've got to stop the money flow from that regime that makes it possible for Kim Jong-un to continue to reward his elites. And also, finally, a third-prong approach. We've got to put these people on notice that are serving this regime. They will be held accountable. And I've been urging the South Korean government to take legal action. They've got 834 cases of North Korean defectors who have given testimonies to the National Human Rights Commission about atrocities that were committed against them. I have been trying to claim to the South Koreans, you've got to start naming names and holding people responsible. And the reason why I came to that suggestion, I believe about 7 or 8 years ago, is because I met a young woman who lost her 14-year-old daughter, who was beaten to death by a North Korean border guard when they got separated, when the two of them were trying to escape out of North Korea. And I thought, how does somebody beat to death a 14-year-old girl who was trying to escape with her mother to South Korea? What kind of cruelty? And I thought, you've got to let that person know, we know who you are, we know what you did, and we've got to start naming names. And while the UN Human Rights Commission on inquiry, I think, was a very important thing, we know that that commission of inquiry going to the International Criminal Court is going to be blocked by Russia and China. So I've been advocating that South Korea also move forward. So thank you very much. I hope I stayed on point on time. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Bob, you're welcome to stay there, or you can stand up, whatever you'd like. Whatever's most comfortable for you.
Thank you, Walter. It's really an honor for me to sit with Susan and John together. And before I have my presentation, I want to show that a very short video. These are just some of the images basically representing the overall human rights situation in China in 2014. So last year perhaps marked the worst year in human rights record in China in the past decade. Many estimated the number of arbitrary arrests for dissidents, for human rights activists, for journalists, for petitioners, for religious dissidents had really outnumber the combination of the past 10 years. And for today, I just want to focus on the religious freedom situation in China, particularly on the persecution against the underground or the Christian adherents. As it is widely known, mainland China under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party is the largest atheist country in the world. Although the Article 36 of the Chinese Constitution did say the citizens of People's Republic of China have freedom of religious belief. However, the truth of the matter is the Chinese citizens have not experienced the true religious freedom in the past 60 or more years under the rule of the Chinese Communist government. In fact, since the communists seized power in 1949, they have openly regarded religion as an opium of the people. According to the data compiled by the Chinese government itself in the 1950s, 8,840 Christian clergymen in mainland China were killed, and 39,200 sent to labor camps after they were convicted as evil despot landowners. An additional 2,450 clergymen were killed, and 24,800 sent to labor camps to be reformed after being convicted as counter-revolutionaries. During the same period, Buddhists and Muslims suffered similar levels of persecution. In addition to the fact that the majority of temples and mosques were closed, Chinese local government actors at various locations forced monks and nuns to resume secular life, and in some cases forced them to marry. In other cases, the Chinese government even forced Muslims to eat pork. In the early 1960s, Tibet was forced to adopt the Chinese communist policy of so-called retaining only one temple in each county. As a result, out of 2,600 temples in Tibet, only 70 remained after approximately 97% of the temples were totally destroyed. In response to Chairman Mao's order that, quote, lamas must go home, and the quote, over 111,000 monks and nuns were married and resumed a secular life under the pressure. So during the Cultural Revolution, the majority of religion in China were completely destroyed by the Chinese regime, and the persecution of religious worshippers reached an alarming level. As China entered the 1980s, the Chinese government adopted a policy of reform, and its control over religion was slightly eased, allowing for 5 major religions to exist to a limited extent. However, the Chinese Communist government strictly enforced the control over the 5 officially sanctioned religions. The result of being Buddhist and Taoist temples have degenerated into a government-controlled tourist venue. And the government-sanctioned so-called 3 self-churches have compromised their faith to principles of Communist Party nationalism. Tibetan Buddhism and Islam also continue to endure religious persecution. In the past few years, over 130 Tibetan Buddhists have self-immolated in protest against the so-called religious freedom policies of the Communist Party. And all registered to all resistance to religious persecution by Muslim communities have been met with brutal violence in the name of so-called anti-terrorism by the Chinese regime. There's not enough time, of course, for me to describe in detail the status of religious persecution in China overall. But as a former pastor of a Chinese house church in Beijing, as the founder of the President of China Aid, I have both direct experience and reliable information on the status of Christianity, and can testify on the ongoing persecution of the house church movement in China. In July 1950, the Wu Yaozong and other Chinese Christians being pressured and directed by the Chinese central authorities jointly issued the so-called Three Self Declaration or manifesto, launched the Three Self Patriotic Movement, which called on the Chinese churches to follow the principle of self-governance, self-support, and self-propagation, end quote. As a result, the Chinese government demanded that religious organizations and venues be registered through the government agencies, and that the Christian Catholic parishioners must attend a TSPM church, thus accepting the leadership of the United Front Working Department and the State Administration for Religious Affairs. In response, many Chinese citizens have refused to adhere to these stipulations, believing the government has interfered in their right to religious freedom and are thus unwilling to join the TSPM churches. As a result, religious activities are being held underground and typically in Christian residence, commonly referred to as house churches or underground churches. There have been estimates that the number of house church believers has reached to over 50 million, at least, far exceeding the number of worshippers in TSPM churches. In response, the Chinese government from the 1950s adopted a policy of closing house churches and persecuting its members and leaders, including sentencing such well-known church leaders as Pastor Wang Mingdao and Pastor Walter Ni, Pastor Alan Yuan, and Pastor Samuel Lam. And for decades, simply for refusing to join the TSPM movement. In many of these cases, the house churches pastors died as martyrs. In the 1980s and 90s, most pastors and elders of the house churches in various provinces that reach a certain number of members were framed and falsely imprisoned on even criminal charges. In the 2000s, urban churches such as the Shouwang Church of Beijing, Wanbang Missionary Church of Shanghai, and Early Rain Reformed Church in Chengdu experienced rapid growth. As the church experienced growth and as various social crises emerged, the Chinese regime entered into a so-called stage of maintaining stability through violence. That is, the government relied on the police, not the rule of law, to maintain its political power and social stability. As a result, the house church movement began to suffer systematic and continuous persecution. For example, the Chinese police forced the landlord to stop leasing property utilized by the Shouwang Church of Beijing, the largest house church in Beijing with over 1,000 members. As a result, members of the Shouwang Church were forced to hold their Sunday worships outdoors on November 1st, 2009. To find a resolution, the Shouwang Church attempted even to register their church with the government in the effort to demonstrate the legitimacy of their church. And they also raised funding to purchase new locations for their building. And unfortunately, the government refused to let them register as a legal church, and even refused to refuse the church to enter into their purchased building by pressuring the landlord to refuse to give them the key. As a result, since April 10th, 2011, the members of the Shouwang Church have held their worship services at outdoor public venues, which the Chinese government regards as an illegal assembly. Unfortunately, during the past 4 years, members of the Shouwang Church have been detained on a weekly basis, resulting in over 3,000 individuals, believers, detentions for simply safeguarding their right to freely worship. The pastor of Shouwang Church and their elders, including Pastor Jin Tianming, have been under house arrest since that time. In recent years, the Chinese government authorities have detained and arrested a large number of house church pastors and missionaries on criminal charges such as illegal business operation and disrupting the public order. According to conservative estimates on religious persecution, there were 143 cases related to Christian persecution in China, with a total of 1,470 Christians being detained and 7,424 being persecuted for their faith in 2013. And the Chinese government also continued to confiscate house church property, religious books and materials, and impose fines. In the past few years, the Chinese government began persecuting house churches under the pretext of so-called evil cults, labeling 14 religious organizations as evil cults, including the Eastern Lightning, the Christian, the local church. In addition, the Chinese government began strictly banning church members and leaders from preaching in universities and colleges, and frequently interfering in church Sunday schools, summer camps, and Christian schools. In 2013, the Chinese government began harassing and persecuting its own state-sanctioned TSPM churches. For example, on April 28, 2013, the Wenzhou government dispatched a large number of police, and you watched on that video, to demolish that large Sanjiang church of Wenzhou. And it was a government-sanctioned church. And although the church spent over 30 million yuan with the permission, with the legal permit by the local government, and the government mobilized a few thousand military police and surrounded the church, and the church was eventually completely destroyed in April 28th. In 2014, the Nanle Church, another government-sanctioned church in Henan province, was entered into a legal dispute, and then, as a result, their pastor, Pastor Zhang Shaojie, and 23 other key members and leaders were arrested. At present, the pastor Zhang Shaojie and one of the other leaders have been sentenced to prison, and Pastor Zhang was sentenced to 12 years last July 4th. And in 2014 alone, the Zhejiang government began the so-called demolish the church buildings in the name of so-called violation for building codes, and dismantle church crosses throughout the province. By the end of 2014, according to our record, over 416 crosses had been forcibly removed, and dozens of churches had been demolished in Zhejiang province. Unfortunately, the Chinese government campaign of removing the crosses of government-sanctioned TSPM churches and other persecution continued to spread to other provinces. In fact, we can easily argue that in 2014 perhaps was the worst year since the end of the Cultural Revolution, and in which the Chinese government had severely persecuted even the TSPM churches. So in light of these facts, we can say with confidence that there has been really never a true religious freedom in China since 1949. Noting the Communist Party has recent years tightened their control on the TSPM churches and had made considerable efforts to destroy the house church movement, and the future of religious freedom in China appears extremely bleak. Of course, despite of this persecution, and I think the kind of optimistic picture is the human rights defense movement and the religious freedom defense movement on the grassroots level had been really growing even faster. And we have a report from the Purdue University, according to Dr. and Professor Yang Fenggang's estimate, by 2030, the number of Chinese Christians will definitely, inevitably, reach to over 224 million, and which will make China the largest Christian nation by that time. And how to really handle this persecution, and I have just two very specific suggestions and proposals. And first of all, I think the administration and the BBG should really take a concerted effort to make the internet freedom, the software available to the millions and millions of Chinese internet users and the cell phone users. I think Congress already passed that act last year, the preparation for this year, and it's time really to make a meaningful effort to make that as a reality. And secondly, for the new Congress, it's important and critical, really, to pass the China Human Rights Protection Act, drafted by Congressman Chris Smith, and it's time to really make these human rights abusers pay a price. At minimum, we should say no, and to say to those abusers of the human rights in China that they're not welcome to enter into the United States. And so I think by even simply doing these two things, I think not only China, the Chinese people will benefit, but also really some worst human rights abusers in the world, like North Korea, like Burma, like other regimes, will also take notice. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much. My name again is John Sifton. I'm the Asia Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the other countries in Asia. Obviously, China and North Korea get a lot of attention, and rightly so. But giving them all the attention would be entirely misplaced, since Asia is so large and has so many other human rights problems, none of which really match China and North Korea in scale and severity, but many of which are nevertheless extremely serious. So I'm going to basically conduct a lightning round and try to very quickly note off some of the areas of concern, and then focus in particular on two countries, Burma and Thailand, which are especially relevant right now, especially with respect to U.S.-Asia policy. Asia regionally obviously has a serious human rights problem. As a region, its governments have a weaker embrace of human rights norms than pretty much any other region in the world in terms of signing up for treaties, in terms of embracing the norms, and in terms of creating institutions to safeguard human rights. There's no Asian court or commission, like there's an African commission or an Inter-American commission or a European Court of Human Rights. And that's no surprise, because the fact is many governments in Asia are openly hostile to human rights norms, something that we can perhaps discuss in the question period. But to begin running through a few countries, I mean, 2014 and 2015 are seeing some serious backsliding and retrenchment in many, many countries, not only China and North Korea, which is, of course, enduring. The only thing I would add to emphasize it in China, by the way, is an issue of the crackdown in the West in areas that are predominantly Muslim. We're seeing a lot of refugees coming out of China now who are Uyghur Muslims, and this is becoming a very serious problem. I'll just add that as a thing of emphasis. But in other countries, I mean, yes, you're seeing a few glimmers of hope out there. You have Indonesia, a country which is a huge country which has emerged from authoritarianism and held elections, and just had an election, an amazing election in which a leader was elected, the likes of which Indonesia has never seen. You know, and there's glimmers in Burma, which I'm going to discuss in a second. Sri Lanka just had a surprise in its election and shook off a authoritarian, dynastic politician to the surprise of many people. And yet, for all those glimmers of hope in countries like that, you have so many enduring problems across the region. Malaysia, a prime minister, Najib Razak, who was initially reform-minded, has reverted to stale old Malay first nationalism and has pretty much scrapped his entire so-called reform agenda that he announced many years ago. He pledged to reform many of Burma's laws and has frankly failed to do so. In India, which also just had an election, we have increasing concerns about the threats of sectarianism as a leader who definitively himself is interested in pursuing economic and reform-minded agenda items, sits atop a party and a movement which has many members who are more interested in championing a frankly extremist ideology of Hindu nationalism, some of which is very hateful and divisive and could derail Prime Minister Modi's agenda going forward. So that's a very concerning. There's also the enduring catastrophe of caste discrimination in India, which remains stubbornly unchanged. Years and years of horrible discrimination continue. Cambodia. This month marks the 30th year of Hun Sen's rule. Hun Sen, the leader of Cambodia, is the 6th longest serving head of government in the world. He has supposedly been elected several times, but in elections which almost nobody consider to be free and fair. This country has seen enormous economic growth, but beneath that, the surface of its prosperity, which is still relatively minor, but huge compared to where it's come from, sits this just stagnant political situation with an authoritarian leader who has clung to power ruthlessly through violence or corruption, depending on the month and the week, and is a stubborn problem. Laos, I'm not even going to get into it. It's a catastrophe. It's an authoritarian one-party state. But worse still than all of these very bad areas is this phenomenon that you see in a lot of areas in Asia, which I'm not going to turn to, where countries take one step forward and then one step back, one step forward or two steps back. And that brings us to Burma, as well as Thailand. A quick just detour. I mentioned India, so I might as well mention Nepal and Bangladesh very quickly. Both countries are having terrible political turmoil right now. Bangladesh has this enormous problem with a prime minister who sits atop a one-party state because the opposition boycotted last year's elections. Big problems there. Nepal is having a constitutional crisis right now. As we speak, parliamentarians are literally fighting with each other, fist fighting with each other in the parliament and throwing chili powder dust into each other's eyes. So, a lot of problems there. But now to Burma and Thailand. So Burma had so much promise in 2012 2012, the junta that ruled the country for decades finally began to show signs that it was unclenching its fists. And the Obama administration rightly embraced the opportunity to engage with them and help this country move towards democracy. But then something kind of horrible happened. Nobody in the Obama administration, I think, thought enough about the underlying causality of what was going on. Why was this junta releasing its grip on power? Had they become enlightened? Or was it that they were finally, after decades, responding to the isolation they were suffering on the world stage and the sanctions that were hampering their capacity to grow economically, and recognized, like authoritarian governments have done all the way back to King John in the year 1215, that in order to remain in power, they had to give up some of their power. There's a Danish historian, I believe his name is David Gress, once wrote a book called From Plato to NATO, which I always thought was a great title for a book, in which he basically outlines how through the history of human liberty, governments have always given human rights and given out freedoms in order to keep power. And I've always thought that that was a very intelligent insight, and it's very applicable in Burma. This regime does not want to hand over power. It wants to stay in power. And yet, the United States government could have seen the situation as an opportunity to basically pull a trick that has been pulled many times on many governments, whereby they try to do this thing that David Gress has written about, give up power in order to keep power, but in the process of doing it, they lose control of the situation and, in fact, lose power. This is the underlying trick of dealing with a regime like Burma's, and frankly, the Obama administration didn't pull it off. The incentives, the sanctions, instead of being gradually relaxed in a way where specific reforms were rewarded with incremental relaxation on the sanctions, step by step, the majority of the sanctions were relaxed, suspended, in one go, essentially. I mean, it was a little bit incremental, but it was essentially one go. And now the United States has very little leverage and buttons to push and levers to pull to incentivize the regime. They've got military assistance, they've got this, that, and the other thing. They've got the fact that, of course, the sanctions remain on the books. But their leverage has been drastically reduced. And that was essentially the underlying sin. It's kind of too late now to fix that. It would be very difficult to pull a 180. And even, I think, the Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, who's had huge interest in this country, recognizes that. So now it's a question of using the remaining leverage, weak as it is, to continue to push. And this is going to be a big year. There's an election. It's very clear now that the constitutional reforms that are necessary to allow the leader of the opposition, Aung San Suu Kyi, to run, to stand for president, are not going to happen. Those reforms are not going to happen. The reforms that would remove the military's constitutional stranglehold on power, its capacity to dismiss parliament, and its other powers over civilian government are not going to occur. And so you're going to have an election in which Aung San Suu Kyi and her party and any allied parties need to win 66% of the contested seats simply to have a majority, whereby the ruling party need only win 33% of the seats and combine it with their 25% parliamentary bloc that they already have under the Constitution and rule the country. So it's a very problematic situation facing in Burma. On top of the democracy front, there's a religious tolerance problem which has been brewing with divisive, hateful, supposedly Buddhist leaders fostering an incredible amount of hate speech towards, engaging in a huge amount of hate speech towards the country's Muslim population, and which is in turn spilled over into violence, not just in the western Rohingya areas, which has gotten a lot of attention, the Rohingya persecution in 2012 and 2013, which led to their segregation into ghettoized camps, but also even in cities in central Burma, where violence has erupted against Muslims, ordinary Muslims in those places, non-Rohingya Muslims. And by the way, when I say ghettoization in Arakan State in the West, I'm not referring to ghettos in the American sense. I'm referring to ghettos in like the Warsaw ghetto sense. These are horrible camps in which Rohingya are essentially entirely deprived of their liberty and dependent on the government for assistance and have no health care whatsoever. On top of the religious front, which, by the way, the government is doing almost nothing to claw back, and in fact, the ruling party seems to see the divisiveness as a political opportunity. They've introduced laws which would pander to these sort of hateful, supposedly Buddhist leaders, laws on conversion, intermarriage, really terrible laws. We've put out a statement, can be seen on that, on Human Rights Watch's website. On top of the religious front, Burma is a country which suffers from more insurgencies than I think any other country I can think of in the world. There are separate insurgencies being fought against the central regime in almost every peripheral region of the country, from all the ones that border Thailand up to China and over to India. Every single peripheral region is fighting an insurgency against the Burman, heartland. There was talk in 2012 of working towards a national ceasefire agreement. Ceasefire, not peace deal, a ceasefire agreement. That has gone nowhere, and that's just ceasefire. The government has sent out negotiators who have repeatedly made demands that simply cannot be met by ethnic leaders. And ethnic leaders themselves are not flawless. The ethnic groups and their military groups have committed human rights abuses, although nowhere even close in scale to the Burman military. But that's going nowhere. Human Rights Watch doesn't take a position on the sides in armed conflict, but there is no mistaking about the conduct of hostilities. The Burmese military is one of the most cruel militaries in the world. It's probably the only place where we've seen just sort of routine sadism that goes well beyond anything which you'd even resemble military necessity. They use convicts as porters. They force civilians to serve as slaves, to carry their equipment, as well as service them sexually. They use sex slaves. I mean, it is an atrocious military with a long history of abuse. And as long as these ethnic conflicts persist, you're going to continue to see those human rights abuses. And there's no prospect for accountability and no discussion of it. So that, is another catastrophe with Burma. The problem right now is that you see already with the democracy front that the United States has let its foot off the gas. It's even worse on the ethnic conflict. And so it's very important going forward that as the United States and whoever leads it over the next 5 years focuses on Burma, that they not just focus on Aung San Suu Kyi and the issue of the Constitution and democracy, but also focus on this horrible legacy of conflict and the religious issues I discussed. Now, how to do that we can discuss. Basically, it's a question of using those remaining incentives and disincentives that the United States has at their disposal. And one of those in particular is military assistance. I'm going to come back to that in a second, how the U.S. does military assistance, but that's a good segue to Thailand. Now, Thailand's problem is, in some ways, more simple. Thailand suffered a military coup last May, and this time, Thailand has had many military coups in the past, but this time it's different. it looks like for the first, in the past, the Thai military has taken power, but it's often served as a kind of a reset, and there's every sense that there would be a return to civilian rule at some point. This time it looks like the military is here to stay for quite some time. They have clamped down on civil society and free speech. They've clamped down, obviously, on the political opposition, the political party that they overthrew, but they've even shelved and shuttered the parties which were sympathetic to the coup in the first place, although far in a much more subtle way. And now it looks like elections, which they initially talked about having somewhat soon, are probably not going to happen anytime soon. Since this is being aired over the internet, I can't even go into some of the underlying issues that lie beneath the surface, but suffice it to say, it remains a kingdom ruled by a king, and I have to be very careful so that I don't break Thai law and end up getting arrested the next time I'm in Thailand. But the bottom line is, the king is quite old, and the succession to the next monarchy is lurking behind this as a driving force. The military of Thailand, its primary loyalty is not to the people of Thailand or to the constitution, but to the king. And this is a very important issue that is lurking in the background. As with Burma, though, what can the United States do about it? There's not a lot of leverage left with Thailand other than trade issues and the military. Remarkably, Thailand has a terrible record on trafficking in persons and has been demoted to Tier 3 on the State Department's list of how bad you can be on trafficking in persons. And there it sits. That is supposed to trigger negative actions by the United States government in terms of sanctions and assistance, but those have been waived. It might be time to start thinking about invoking some of those, as well as scaling back on military assistance even more than has already automatically happened because a coup took place. Unfortunately, the Pentagon seems to disagree and is going to go forward with the limited engagement that it does take place. There is a regional exercise that's held in Thailand every year that the Pentagon is going to go ahead and have. I think one thing to consider going forward is to cancel those military exercises, although that has repercussions for other bilateral engagements with countries like Indonesia, to go ahead and cancel those military exercises and really start not sanctioning yet, but isolating the Thai military on the world stage, making them seem more pariah-like. Bottom line, there are a lot of messes in Asia, and at the core of it lies a hollow policy from the Obama administration with respect to human rights in Asia. The Asia pivot, in short, lacks a moral center. And as long as that remains the case, it's going to be very difficult to address any of the problems I've been talking about. What we advise the White House now, as a human rights group, is not to scrap the Asia pivot and sort of turn away from Asia, but to imbue it with a moral content about human freedom, about human rights, and speak not to Asian governments, but Asian people. So don't have a pivot to Asia, have a pivot to Asians. And start making the human rights pillar that is supposedly part of the Asia pivot have real substance. Have there be consequences when there's retrenchment, like there was in Thailand, backsliding like there was in Burma. Real consequences in terms of spending, military assistance, trade issues. And we can discuss the specifics of those consequences. I mean, you can get into very detailed discussions of the foreign appropriations bill and the spending, on military assistance and other issues. too complicated to get into here. But the bottom line is it needs to be operationalized. And the good news is on a lot of these countries, there's bipartisan agreement. You know, it's great to see in Burma a Democratic congressman from New York and a Republican senator from Kentucky in lockstep on, you know, Burma policy. On Cambodia, it's great to see, you know, people on both sides, from Senator Leahy to Senator Graham, agreeing completely on Cambodia policy. So there's a lot of opportunities to just agree on, you know, spending cuts or spending changes and other incentives and disincentives. So I think that's an opportunity that the Obama administration needs to grab by the horns. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, and we can have questions.
That's great. Thank you. That was an amazing tour of every other country in Asia. I want to open it up to questions. Always helps, I think, to sort of prime the pump a little bit with one of my own. So please do think of these presentations and areas you want to explore a little bit more. But I wanted to ask Suzanne specifically, the situation you mentioned with regard to the teenage girls that were apprehended in Laos. And you talked about this sort of cooperation between North Korean, Chinese, and Laotians to get them back to North Korea. Where was the South Korean government in all of this? Did they protest? Did they intervene with Beijing, which I guess is probably their principal leverage point? They do have good relationships in Southeast Asia generally. What did they do about this?
Well, I think they were completely blindsided and caught off guard. And we don't know and may not know until the regime collapses exactly why the intense effort to prevent these 9 children from getting to South Korea, why did that happen? The rumor is that there was a high-ranking leader in North Korea whose daughter had escaped. That may have been they thought they were rounding her up. Or it was simply that there was a high-ranking North Korea official in Laos at the time. The procedure has been, when there's a refugee that shows up in Laos, that the Laotian government will inform the North Koreans and the South Koreans, and then the South Koreans move in quickly and help them come to South Korea. What happened here, we don't know, but we do know this. I can tell you for a fact, because we were working on this rescue. It was part of a larger rescue of a group of over 20 refugees. Several have made it here, and 2 groups made it to South Korea that were being sheltered by a North Korean defector and her husband. Her husband was a pastor, like Bob Fu. He was a South Korean pastor in this case, but he was working in China. He had a shelter there, and he was gradually rescuing all the children. And then what happened there is they got to Laos. They had been in touch with the South Koreans. They were under the impression they were going to go to South Korea. Those children were walking out of the detention center saying "Manse," because hooray, they thought they were going to South Korea. The Laotians blocked the missionary and his wife, locked them in a room, and then the children were taken to a plane, Chinese, and flown to Beijing, and then from Beijing right to Pyongyang. So it was the conspiracy of those 3 countries cannot be more exaggerated. But
am I wrong that there have been times in the past where the South Korean government, despite its official position, has been less than enthusiastic about encouraging North Korean refugees and bringing them?
I would say in the past, but
and has that changed?
No, it hasn't changed. In fact, I can tell you that when I talked to the South Koreans when this happened, because I was on phone contact with somebody who was in direct contact with the missionary, they were shocked. I think they were caught off guard. Now, they were very much criticized. There was an investigation, but it's always quick. Everybody's always quick to turn on each other when something tragic like this happens. But we have to remember we're the good guys. But that happens a lot when a tragedy like this happens, and some people are quick to condemn South Korea. But let's face it, you had these 3 countries conspire. The only way that this could have happened were those 3 countries just conspire, and they were caught off guard so that they would do something that horrible when these children were trying to get out. I can tell you that in other countries, like in Thailand, when refugees get there, we have had successful rescues out of Laos because the Laotians have tended to allow people safe passage through their country. They just do it very quietly. We've had people come through Laos many times and got in South Korea, and many times also to the United States. There's a family that we rescued that came through Laos. And the irony is that the Laotians have done this quietly, but Thailand, they put them in jail for crossing the border, but they won't repatriate them, which is great. I mean, they won't force the North Koreans back to North Korea, so there's great in their compassion, but they do put them in jail for crossing their border illegally because they're not a signatory to the international treaty, the refugee convention. So they're not obligated legally to not force them back, but they won't do that, which is good. So the irony is, it's usually safer to go. It can be safer to go through Laos because you don't have to end up in a detention center if you go through Thailand. But this continues to be a horrible situation, and one of our first priorities should be to save refugees and help these refugees, and pressure China on this, because really the ultimate source of this problem is the Chinese, and they are a signatory to the Refugee Convention, and when they force a North Korean back to North Korea, they know for certain that that North Korean refugee, many times women and children, most of them are women and children, they know for certain that those people will most certainly be in prison, most certainly be tortured, and in many cases, increasingly now, executed, simply for trying to escape for a better life. So this is an issue we continue to have to pressure China.
I add one point to that. And it didn't get a lot of attention, but the UN Commission of Inquiry had a little section about China and its complicity in crimes against humanity vis-a-vis repatriations. It didn't get a huge amount of attention, but it irked a lot of people in Beijing, there's no doubt.
Thanks. I want to open it up to others. Yeah. We have a microphone for you.
I couldn't agree more with everything that is said here. And after World War II, we thought we'd learned the lesson that never again could we be silent and passive in the face of escalating atrocities and weapons programs by totalitarians. Then I think you can look at North Korea and say, overall, that's exactly what U.S. policy has been. It's been overall passive and silent in the face of these emerging atrocities and weapons programs. And we've allowed negotiations to serve to provide the regime with cover and time for their weapons programs and human rights violations. And because it creates this veneer of civility, which allows us to think, oh, this is okay that we're being silent and passive. So I just wanted to ask you, I do see this glimmer of hope in terms of the fact that, yet again, the distribution system has broken down, there's a famine, there's an emergence of markets and this sort of thing. But that happened in the past, and because we were so silent and mute and didn't take any advantage of that, nothing came of it, and the government was able to reestablish control over these markets, and we lost the opportunity. So I just wonder, what can we do to take advantage of that opportunity when that whole attitude of passivity remains?
You want to talk specifically about North Korea?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I figured, I just want to
This
make
is
sure.
all about North Korea.
Yeah, I think that first of all, that there's something that's emerged in our recognition of this problem, and that the human rights will never be secondary again. I could tell you stories that would turn your hair white on this battle that's gone on, because I've been working on this issue for over 18 years. I mean, just like when we brought the first survivors of the political prison camps to testify back in 1999, the VOA reporter, his story got spiked. A VOA wrote a story about the political prison camps that got spiked by the State Department because they said they didn't want to jeopardize the four-party talks. So all this agreed framework, four-party talks, six-party talks, all these things that have happened in all these years of negotiating with North Korea, we were completely manipulated. They never were going to intend to do anything but continue their nuclear program. This is what the defectors have told us repeatedly. Hwang Jong-yap, highest-ranking defector, said Kim Jong-il at the time, now Kim Jong-un, he will never give up his nuclear program. Emphasize human rights, that's their Achilles heel. I do think that the human rights issue will no longer be downplayed. I think that the overwhelming evidence, the COI report, groups like Human Rights Watch that have been out there putting out these reports, the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, which I'm also involved in, the body of evidence is so powerful they can no longer ignore this. And I think that it will at least always be equal if not, I believe, the first priority in the human rights. So I don't think that they can put that genie back in the bottle, so to speak. But in addition, it is so important that we utilize, as I mentioned, the defectors that have escaped, because they are in communication with people, with their family members, but also there's nothing more powerful than North Koreans living in South Korea reaching out to North Koreans still living in the enslavement of that dictatorship. There's nothing more powerful than that. That's why Free North Korea Radio has become the most listened to radio station. And I love VOA and RFA and KBS and SBS and everybody that wants to broadcast into North Korea. The more broadcaster, the better. But the one that they target, the one where the regime sends assassins regularly to kill the director, the one that's targeted for the most jamming, is the little defector-run station. It's only on 1 hour a day, every day, Free North Korea Radio. So that tells us how important that is for them getting this information in there and using all the means possible, because I really think that the key is to make the North Koreans themselves aware that the source of their misery is that dictatorship, not South Korea, not the United States, who they were raised to believe from childhood is their sworn enemy, but communicating that. And one of the things I've brought up many times with the Obama administration is this administration sending, and that really underscores what John said, just recommending what John brought up, is speaking these things directly to the people, communicating, which is something that John brought up, talking directly to the people, and letting the North Korean people know that they think they're raised to believe that we want to destroy them. We sit around here talking about what can we do to help the North Korean people. That's what we sit there and debate. What's the best way we can help them? They need to know that, and that's one thing that the president of the leader of the free world, the president of the United States, can best communicate, is that we really care about you. And also with the military, just pointing out to the military in North Korea that more people have died as a result of the policies of the Kim dictatorships than ever died during the Korean War. More North Koreans died because of the dictatorships. And that's something that's got to be communicated to the military, because we saw, like, in Egypt, and then the country that's probably the most like North Korea, although North Korea is in a category by itself, but Ceausescu's Romania. We saw in Romania the military turned against the dictator in favor of the people. So that's why I have hope that we've really got to be more aggressive in pressing on these issues and having that standard that John talked about, a moral compass, talking about these human rights issues and empowering those that have escaped, and giving them the tools and with radio broadcasting and getting information in.
Can I add to that? On the causality front, there's really an interesting phenomenon with North Korea, which is in the last 2 years, basically, it wasn't by design, but an amazing alignment of possibilities took place, where the nuclear talks broke down, a more conservative government took power in Seoul, a more conservative power, I shouldn't say conservative because that's irrelevant, but a different government took power in Seoul, a different government took power in Tokyo. The nuclear talks broke down. The State Department, which had always had this sort of gravity towards the non-proliferation issue, suddenly didn't really have a reason to do that anymore. The White House didn't care. So this amazing confluence occurred, and we were able to create a UN Commission of Inquiry, which would have been impossible, and they said was impossible 3 years ago. Now, you have a situation where in December, the Security Council debated the human rights situation in North Korea for the first time ever, and now can regularly put it on the agenda because China can't veto a procedural vote, if there was one. So in April, they can have a debate, and in that debate, they can speak directly to the elites and say things like, listen, you have a choice to make. You can commit crimes against humanity and be held accountable one day, or not. And think about what that means. Now, with that said, though, I want to caution against the notion that we can somehow game history. We don't really know how the end is going to come. That's the lesson of history. We don't really know when it's going to happen. But we can put people on warning about committing gross human rights abuses, and we can prepare for the day when the end comes. In 1943, the Allied powers set up the War Crimes Commission to gather evidence about Axis atrocities. Unfortunately, it was only used in Germany and not in Italy, but they collected the evidence, And that was all ready to go when the Nazis were defeated and Imperial Japan was defeated. The same thing can happen here. The High Commissioner for Human Rights can sit there in Seoul, collect the evidence, and be ready to unseal those indictments and have some kind of domestic, or refer to the International Criminal Court. But the point is to have the papers and the witnesses all ready to go for when the end comes.
You know, I just want to comment briefly, and then I want to ask Bob a question. But I think getting to the point of sort of not ignoring the issue of human rights in North Korea, I think one big change that's happened that's helpful in that regard is that you have the security strategic types now in Washington that follow this, caring much more about the issue because it appears to be having an impact on that equation. You know, largely because of the Commission of Inquiry, because they noted how strongly the North Koreans reacted, and so now a lot of those people see this as a wedge that can be used for bigger political security, big strategic type aims, and I don't think that that's going to change back. That's sort of a permanent change in the admission of human rights to that broader strategic discussion, which I think is very positive. And then, Bob, I wanted to ask you, I noticed in your presentation several mentions of other religious communities, obviously the Uyghurs, and you singled out Ilam Toti in your slides, and you also talked about Buddhists, et cetera. I personally, I'm very much of the opinion that religious liberty is indivisible. That is, if you want it for yourself, if it's something that Christians need, is really not something that can be denied others as well. You know, regimes generally treat them on some spectrum similarly. But I wonder if you find that true in China. That is, do they seem particularly concerned there about the Christian community? Are there signals that you gain from their treatment of other religious minorities in the country that help you address the problem? And is there any sort of ecumenical type work that's done in China across religious barriers on common interests?
The overall, of course, religious policy in China apply to all the religious groups. Basically, under the kind of leadership of the United Front Working Department and executed by the Religious Affairs Bureau, these religious policies has been implemented to all the religions. However, you can tell actually there are some kind of differences of the emphasis and the Chinese government toward one religion or one religious group over the other. Like last year, in particular, there is a very strong, clear evidence the Chinese regime singled out the Protestant and I think Catholic too, Christianity. I mean, for example, toward the end of the year, besides of course, the anti kind of the forced demolition crosses and even targeted the government sanctioned church. That had never happened since the Cultural Revolution. That in 1976, and that's very, very unusual. Number two is it seems the government propaganda, the media from the newspaper, the military, the Chinese army newspaper to the Global Times, even singled out one Christian, one famous actor, the Sun Haiying, in their editorial, basically said he is the third weapon or number 3 weapon used by the Western democracies to topple China. Because of his Christian faith, simply because of his openly confessed his Christian faith. So the number 1 weapon listed as the universal values. Number 2 is the constitutionalism. So number 3 is Christianity. And of course, there is a so-called new 5 black categories, model after Chairman Mao's in 1950s, the 5 categories. And the number 1 is human rights lawyers. The number 2 is underground religious forces, or especially Christianity. Of course, the Tibetan and Uyghur, the Muslim and Tibetan communities in the West, I would call it the Chinese government singled out atheistic version of Sharia law. Basically, non-conversion law is strictly implemented in Tibet and in Xinjiang. Basically, if you're Tibetan, you have to stay as a Buddhist, and you cannot convert to other religions. I mean, even some of the human rights lawyers, we sort of help, they defend for some of the Christian Uyghurs, like Ali Mujang was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. And in the court, this is the court judge directly tell the lawyers, when the lawyers said, for Uyghur, Muslim convert to Christian faith would not face that kind of criminal charges in Zhejiang or other provinces. And the judge told the lawyer, said, this is Xinjiang, not Zhejiang, and it's not allowed, it's forbidden to convert to another faith. And if you want to see that progress, migrate to other provinces. That's the judge declared in the court.
Your question made me remember that I completely forgot to mention, I didn't forget, it's in my notes, but I forgot to mention Vietnam, where religious liberty is obviously a big, big problem. So obviously it's a one-party state, non-democratic, but one of its biggest human rights sins is its crackdown on organized religion. And there it seems like there isn't a hierarchy between the different houses of worship that they seek to regulate. They just don't like having people in a room together talking to each other. Whether it's about Jesus or the Buddha, they don't like it, so they seek to regulate it. And it's an area where very little progress has been seen.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that too, because one of the reasons why it's difficult to get a dissident movement going in North Korea is because there's a ban on all kinds of associations. I mean, you can't even get together with the people that you went to high school with. That's banned. So there's no way when you think of
I've been trying to avoid that for.
Yeah. But you think of Solidarity or Valenza, there's usually there's a way that people can speak, whether it's in the Czech Republic, whether it was the writers, but in North Korea, people cannot ban or form any kind of club or association. So there's no way for people to interact, and just because of the not being able to exchange or talk about religion or anything. But I do want to just, also in China though, also the Falun Gong and what happened with the Falun Gong. In 1999, this unprecedented crackdown on the Falun Gong practitioners, which was this movement that had expanded all through China. People extremely peaceful. These are people that it's kind of a modern form of Buddhism. Very peaceful, compassionate people. Everyone I've ever met that's Falun Gong is just a very tender, kind-hearted person. And the persecution against them has been incredibly brutal. And the way that I came to know about it was because human rights advocates, rescuers of North Korean refugees in China, they would get in prison and they would tell me about the people that they ran into in prison. Many times were Falun Gong practitioners and Christians. So the crackdown on the Falun Gong has also been just absolutely
most brutal one.
Most brutal. And I just wanted to break that.
Oh, thank you. I guess the big difference perhaps in the different religious minorities is that with the Muslims and the Tibetans, there's an identity attached to it. It's an ethnic issue. And the Chinese government has an interest in keeping those lines as clear as possible. That's why they don't allow the conversion. But with Christianity and also with Falun Gong, it must present a certain mystery to them because it's infecting Han Chinese. And it can be the guy sitting next to you. If he's Uyghur, you might know. Okay, you'll know if he's Uyghur, but you might not know if he's Christian, right? But I think we have to leave the discussion there. Thank you very much. Let me say just briefly, we've got sandwiches outside for folks, and we're going to reconvene for the panel on Russia downstairs in the Larriman Auditorium on the first floor if you're staying for that. But I just wanted to thank our panelists briefly for some outstanding presentations and a very good discussion. Thank you.